When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I was working as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired due to him losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift because you never know if people who order late at night actually want pizza or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss is an asshole and essentially told me that if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporary, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it into my GPS and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrived and it's about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses, but the house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I'm starting to get pretty nervous that something's about to go down, but thankfully a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 feet, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there staring at me. I asked him if he was okay and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. I got off work not too long ago and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza, and as I'm making change he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later I get a delivery to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time and ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and can't wait to get home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know that feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asked me what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks me if he could have my number, as he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15, and I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up to my coworkers and they agreed that it was pretty creepy. Except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. Fucking asshole. A week later I'm working the night shift and we get an order from the same guy again, and this is when shit finally hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30 p.m. And keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in the house was on. I get out of my car and I walk up to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man, except this time he's wearing a suit, and I jumped back. He laughs and says, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out the window and I figured I would just open the door now so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared, because as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house. So he was sitting in the dark this whole time? And if so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the fuck? I once again tell him I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side and grabs my arms, hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him, "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I've ever seen on someone's face and says, "I don't care. Get inside now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into the house and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. While he was doing that, I did something that to this day I am still thankful worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in his stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds and he loosened his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and tries to pull me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm, and even yells, "Why are you making this so fucking difficult?" I grab a half-empty soda bottle I had in the cup holder and throw it, and luckily it hits his head and he lets me go. I slam the door and then all of a sudden he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging at the windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot and reverse down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood screaming, "Stop the fucking car!" I turned onto the next road as swiftly as I possibly could and luckily he falls off the hood of my car. I slammed on the gas to get as far away from that sick bastard as I could. In my panicked state, I drove a couple blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto the side blocks as I feared I was being followed. Eventually I reached a red light and I slammed on the brakes and just sat at the intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I practically broke down in front of him and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself, as well as the scratches on my car from the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed and strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on it was for sex crimes. He had been released from jail about 5 months before this encounter for having sex with a minor. When they arrived at his house, he was long gone and his family had no idea where he ran off to, but the police insisted they would find him. And indeed they did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking home late at night on the street. Luckily somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time, called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they did and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walk down the street and I light up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have an encounter with him ever again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. The experience I had 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I was alone and face to face with a psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me inside his duplex. This is one of my favorite personal stories since everything turned out alright, but I still get chills thinking about how many different ways the night could have gone wrong. A few years ago, my friend Jane and I took a trip to Portland, Oregon. We're both from the south side of Chicago, and Jane was feeling pretty jaded with the city. She was convinced everything was better on the West Coast, including the people. So we flew out to Portland and rented a car, which we named Veronica. The day before we were supposed to fly back home, we took Veronica and drove up to Aberdeen, Washington to see Kurt Cobain's childhood home. After that, we drove along the coast sightseeing along the way. We visited Astoria, Oregon to see the house from the Goonies, and ended the day at Cannon Beach to check out Haystack Rock. All in all, it was a pretty nice day. Once it started to get dark, we decided to head back to our hotel, which was just under 2 hours away. I knew that I needed gas, so I told Jane I would stop at the first gas station I see. Cannon Beach is a small resort-type town. A lot of little shops and restaurants, but I didn't see any signs of gas stations. Being from the city, I'm used to seeing 2 on every corner, so I wasn't really worried. I expected to find one soon. I am completely unfamiliar with the area, so I just kept following the GPS instructions while talking to Jane. Next thing I know, we're not in any type of town. We're on a dark, winding road surrounded by trees. At this point, I'm getting a little worried. I pull over to the side of the road and use the GPS to search for the nearest gas station. It tells me that there's one a mile down the road. Awesome! I'll get some gas and we'll be all set. I'm driving and Veronica tells us that we are at our destination. I pull into a completely dark and empty gas station. We're still surrounded by woods and darkness. As far as I can tell, there's nothing around for miles. According to Veronica, we have about 10 miles worth of gas and the nearest gas station is 30 miles away. Jane and I are sitting there trying to figure out what to do when another car pulls in. I keep going about my business and don't really pay attention to the other car. I just assume they needed gas too. Out of the corner of my eye, I see someone gesturing to me. After some hesitation, I crack the window to see what they want. It's a middle-aged man and his wife in the car. He starts asking us all kinds of questions. Need to fill up? Coming from the beach? Driving back to Portland? I keep my answers polite but short. Then he tells us that he actually owns the gas station we're at, but doesn't make enough money to keep it open that late. He tells us that he knows of a Chevron about 3 miles away and gives us directions for it. He gave us his number and says to give him a call in case we didn't make it to the Chevron. My name is Sam the Mechanic Man. Let me know if you didn't make it and I'll come rescue you ladies. We thank him profusely and head out. Jane is going on and on about how nice that was and how we would have never had that happen in Chicago. I agreed. That was very nice, if odd, of him. Strange that he happened to be driving past his gas station at the same time we pulled in, but whatever. I made a joke about him calling his buddy at the gas station saying, "I'm sending 2 women your way." We make it to the Chevron and this kid, 18 or 19 years old, comes out to pump our gas. He asks us how we're doing and then says, "There's a lot of weirdos out here tonight." Jane and I look at each other and let out a small laugh and say, "Ha, I told you." I turn back to the kid and ask him what he means. He tells me the story about how his brother owes some drug dealers a ton of money and how he's hiding somewhere nearby. He's planning on kicking the shit out of him once he gets off his shift. I can tell Jane is getting uncomfortable with the building weirdness of the night, so I give the kid a good tip, wish him luck, and start driving again. At one point during our conversation, Jane calls Sam the mechanic and leaves him a voicemail. She tells him we made it to the gas station and how much we appreciate his help. I thought the call was unnecessary, but it is what it is. A few minutes later, we're on the highway and about 10 minutes from our hotel. Jane's phone rings and it's Sam. Again, she thanks him profusely. He asks where we're from and when we're flying home. He tells her his name is Sam Glesty, and he wrote a book called Wrongly Accused. We should read it when we're on our plane ride home. This piqued my interest. "Jane, you have to look up that book to see what it's about." She Googles it. Then she goes limp and looks like she's about to puke. "What is it?" He was accused of being the Green River Killer. Immediately, she starts freaking out. He has my number now! Back at the hotel, we do some more digging. Apparently, a victim of the Green River serial killer picked Sam out of a lineup. However, the real killer was caught and convicted based on DNA evidence. But around the same time in the 70s, Sam was convicted and served time for abducting and assaulting a young woman in the area we were in. The book he wrote was about all of that. We ended up stuck in Portland for 2 more days due to a snowstorm in Chicago. It was a weird, tension-filled 2 days. Considering the circumstances and weirdness of that night, things could have gone horribly wrong. I'm glad all I got out of that night was a story. When I was 18, I got a job at Walmart. Small town, not much else there for someone fresh out of high school. I'd been there about a month and worked in the jewelry department, usually from mid-afternoon until the department closed at 9 p.m., and I would close the department myself. But this Walmart was open 24 hours, so other people were always around. One night I'm locking the cases up and putting things away, and an overnight stalker walks by and says hi. I look up, smile and say hi back, and then go back to my business. This guy, the only way I can describe him is to say that he looks like one of the Bee Gees. Shoulder-length frizzy hair, kind of a bouncy hop to his step when he walked, and in his mid-50s. This started to become a regular thing. On nights I closed by myself, he'd walk by and say hi and I'd say hi back. That's it. No conversations ever took place. Then on my birthday, a few of my friends who worked there got me a cake and I hugged them and said thank you. About an hour later, Mr. Bee Gees comes around with a birthday card and gave it to my manager to give to me. My manager thought it was extremely funny that this weirdo got me a card. Until I opened it. Happy birthday. I saw you hugging those guys earlier. It made me really mad. But I called a friend and talked it out, and he made me realize that you're allowed to have friends other than me. Just please don't hug them anymore. Save those hugs for me. I don't know what kind of emotion showed on my face, but my manager grabbed the card and read it, then walked back to the store manager's office and showed it to him. The store manager said this guy was obviously joking, but that he would have a talk with him about it. I didn't see Mr. BG for around a week, until one night while I was closing, he plunked down a stuffed envelope on my counter and walked away without a word. Inside was 6 pages front and back of pure crazy. It was basically his entire life story, all about his family and schools he went to, but with weird stuff, like how his sister was a psychic and his father was an exorcist, and all sorts of weirdness. The end of the letter was about how his friend who was 18 months old was missing, and he knew she was being raped because he could see her screaming in his dreams. What the fuck? So that also went to the store manager, and he had me write a written complaint and told me not to go outside by myself and not to wander near where the guy might be while he's on breaks. No. Get rid of him. 2 nights later, I was finishing up for the night, and the way the counter is set up is there's one opening, and the counters go all the way around on both sides. He brought a handcart around with boxes from my department, but pushed it into the only opening in the counter, so I was trapped inside. He just stood there and stared at me while I looked at him with what I'm sure was terror. I was then, and am still now, riddled with anxiety. I don't like confrontation, and the last thing I wanted was for this weirdo to confront me about reporting him. Twice. He whispers, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." I turned around and started finishing my closing tasks pretending he wasn't even there, though I could feel him watching me. After a few minutes I just looked at him and said, "Weren't you told to stay away from me?" He gave me this gross predator grin and said, "Hank asked me if I was joking." Hank is the store manager. I told him I was. Then he leaned in as close as he could get to me with the counter between us and whispered, "But I'm not joking." Then he walked away. For 2 weeks after this, he would randomly show up wherever I was. I would leave for lunch. He would be there. Even non-work places. I would go to the mall. he would be there. Another department manager told me that he had been reported by 4 other people over the last 2 years for very similar behavior. I again went to my store manager, who told me that the guy was harmless and maybe had a little bit of a crush. He was in his 50s, and I was like 18 or 19 during this crap. A week later, I gave my notice and quit. He still works there. 13 years later. Still gives me the heebie-jeebies. This story starts on a Thursday night in May of 2017. I work in retail, and after a long shift one night, called an Uber home so I could avoid the dodgy people that hang around at the train station. I wish I had known that this simple act of calling for transportation would lead to a 6-month-long ordeal of harassment and obsession. I got into the car and chatted with the middle-aged driver, who I'll call Tim. He had a strong Turkish accent and seemed friendly. The conversation was normal at first, with him asking where I worked and why I was out so late, and what I was studying, etc. As the conversation progressed, he began to make comments that started to make me feel uncomfortable. He started to comment on how pretty I was, and how young I looked, and how he missed the times when he was young and could get girls like me. He then put his hands on my knee and patted it affectionately and tried to push my hair out of my face. I was very aware that he was controlling a moving vehicle, so I just ignored him and prayed that he would get to our destination quicker. When he pulled up to our place, he noticed a car was in the driveway and immediately retracted his hand. He asked me if I wanted to go out for coffee sometime. I politely declined and said that I had a partner. He told me he was a lucky man and that I could call him any time for a free ride. He then reached out and kissed my hand. I felt physically sick but thanked him for the ride and got out as quickly as I could. As soon as I was inside, I told my boyfriend what had happened, who encouraged me to report the driver. I was apprehensive at first, as he knew my address, but eventually reported it as I knew we were moving soon. I was reassured by Uber that the matter would be investigated and I would receive a full refund for the trip. I didn't hear anything from Tim after that, and was soon busy into my study schedule, working and moving house. I had forgotten about him until around August, where by chance I ran into him at our cafe. I was in line to get a coffee when he tapped me on the shoulder. My heart sank. He gave me a big smile and tried to give me a hug, which I declined. "Hey, I've missed your pretty face. Where have you been?" "I'm super busy. Sorry, I can't really talk," I sputtered. I ordered my coffee hastily and burst out the door with him hot on my trail. He started walking beside me, matching my pace. I was starting to breathe heavily and hyperventilate. "Hey, so I could have bought you that coffee. We still need to go on that coffee date." I told him no. I was not interested and that he was making me uncomfortable. He then physically grabbed my hand as we were walking. I actually sputtered out, "What the fuck? What are you doing?" He replied, "Oh, is that too soon?" "Too soon? Too soon for what? We are not on a date. I am not interested. Leave me alone." I said this loudly enough for people around me to hear, and a few people had started to pay attention. "Oh, are you a lesbian or something?" "No, I am just not interested in you." I was mortified. I had officially lost it and started to cry. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you," he said, and he tried to pat my back. I physically flinched and walked away from him, close to having a mental breakdown. He called out behind me as I was leaving, "You still work at that shoe store, right?" I realized then that I had told him where I worked that night, and that he had picked me up and seen me in uniform. I had also told him where and what I studied. I couldn't believe my stupidity. I alerted my store manager, who then alerted shopping center security, who assured me that they would be on the lookout. Sure enough, my first shift back after that cafe run-in, my manager told me that someone had come in asking for my phone number and when I was on my next shift, claiming to be my boyfriend. My manager refused to give him this information and immediately notified security, but by the time they arrived, he had already left. They showed me the grainy security footage of people coming into our store around that time, and sure enough, it was Tim. I was told that if he came in again to go and hide in the back and that the other girls on shift would deal with him. A few months later, he tried to add me on Facebook. I immediately changed my number on Uber so I couldn't be identified anymore. I have a pretty unique name, and blocked him. The most recent incident happened this last September. I was tidying the window display out in the front of the store when I immediately felt like I was being watched. I looked to my left, and sure enough, Tim was there. I pretended to not know him and said, "Can I help you, sir?" "Just admiring your beauty," he said with a smile. He then gave me an envelope and walked out before I could say anything. Inside was a card saying that he really felt a connection and thanking me for my help today, even though I had never served him, and a voucher to a local bikini store for $100. Anyway, I realize now is the time to involve the police, and I'm kicking myself for not contacting them in the first place. I haven't heard from him since, and I'm praying that I don't ever hear from him again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And if you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to yourmaker6260@gmail.com. That name again is yourmaker6260@gmail.com. Act now. And if you would like to help support the channel, I highly recommend you check out the sponsor button or my Patreon page. So have any of you ever had a stalker? I don't know if I did. I might have once, but it might have just been a girl who liked me. I'm not sure. But yeah, have you ever had a stalker? A stalker. Not like a grocery stalker. A stalker. Stalker! So as you can tell by the title, I'm in the rain, butt naked reading this. Probably not, but no one ever knows. Regardless, I appreciate you checking out this video, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I will catch you in the next one. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. Bad bye.